Is states' rights a thing anymore? Does the US Constitution count in this era? Is the rule of law something that binds all Americans together, like our founding fathers intended? These are the questions many are asking. Where does this aggressive push by the executive branch to deploy the National Guard into American cities, often against the will of local and state leaders, lead us all? We're going to dive into something brewing under the surface. A slow burn now threatening to explode into a full-blown constitutional crisis. This isn't just about public safety anymore. It's about federalism, executive power, and the very fabric of our democratic process. For months now, we've watched federal officials pressure Illinois to accept National Guard deployment into Chicago. The justification? Crime, migrant surges, and so-called national security risks. But here's the truth. Neither Chicago's Mayor Brandon Johnson nor Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker requested federal military intervention. Both rejected it. They said it would escalate tensions and undermine local law enforcement. And yet, despite their clear refusal, the administration pushed forward, triggering a constitutional showdown. The move was immediately challenged in federal court, and a U.S. district judge issued a temporary injunction blocking the deployment, saying the executive branch may not have unilateral authority to militarize a city that explicitly rejected federal intervention. That ruling sent shockwaves through legal and political circles because it wasn't just about Chicago. The judge invoked the 10th Amendment and warned that allowing the president to federalize the National Guard without state consent would upend the constitutional balance. In plain language, if the president can send military force into any state at any time, using vague justifications like public order or national concern, then state sovereignty becomes meaningless. This isn't a left versus right issue. This is a raw power struggle, and people across the political spectrum are suddenly waking up to the implications. Chicago isn't the first battleground, it's just the latest. Rewind to Oregon. During the peak of unrest in Portland, the federal government sent unmarked federal agents to detain protesters without local approval. Then came the push to deploy National Guard troops over objections from Governor Kate Brown. The state sued, and once again, a federal judge stepped in, blocking the deployment and stating the president cannot invoke the Insurrection Act as a political tool. That judge wrote something powerful. Federal authority is not a weapon to be used against states exercising lawful governance. Whether you agree with Oregon politics or not, that ruling matters. Because what started in Portland has now turned into a broader constitutional war. And now, the stakes just went nuclear. After being blocked in both Oregon and Illinois by federal judges, Donald Trump has taken the fight to the highest court in the land. In a move that legal analysts are calling historic and unprecedented, Trump has formally petitioned the Supreme Court to rule on whether a president has the authority to deploy the National Guard into U.S. cities without permission from state governors. This case isn't just another political fight. It's a direct challenge to the limits of presidential power. Trump argues that as commander-in-chief, the Constitution gives him full authority to deploy military forces anywhere in the United States when public safety or federal interests are at risk, regardless of what state leaders say. For months now, we've seen this argument taking shape behind closed doors, through leaked memos and quiet legal positioning within the Justice Department. But with this Supreme Court filing, that argument has now exploded into public view. The administration insists that unrest, crime, or border-related instability inside cities like Chicago or Portland constitutes a national security threat. And if the president is blocked from using the National Guard in these situations, they argue, he cannot fulfill his constitutional duty to preserve, protect, and defend the United States. It's a strategic legal argument, but also a dangerous one if abused. Because history tells us whenever one branch of government tries to expand its power, it rarely gives it back. Let that sink in. If the Supreme Court sides with Trump, we may witness the most dramatic shift in American power dynamics since World War II. Governors have always been commanders of their own National Guard troops unless they voluntarily cooperate with Washington or unless Congress-authorized crises like war or rebellion trigger federal control. But under Trump's legal theory, that boundary could vanish. Any president, not just Trump, but any future president, could declare crime a national emergency, label protests as threats to federal stability, and deploy the National Guard into any city, even when state leaders and local residents reject it. That isn't hypothetical. That's the real-world impact of this case. Imagine the consequences. A Republican president could send troops into New York to shut down migrant shelters if state officials refused. A Democratic president could send troops into Texas to seize guns under a so-called national security firearm crackdown. One administration could deploy forces to monitor elections in swing states. Another could send them to break up protests they deem dangerous misinformation gatherings. The minute the precedent is set that the federal government can bypass state authority and send military power into civilian streets, American self-government changes forever. Whether you cheer or fear, this moment depends entirely on how comfortable you are giving massive unchecked power to Washington, because once it's there, it's never coming back. This isn't just a legal fight, and it isn't just politics. This is the collision point between two visions of America. One vision believes the federal government should have final say over security and order, even if that means overriding states and local elected officials. The other believes that states still have constitutional authority and that centralized federal power is the greatest threat to liberty. Chicago and Oregon were just warning shots. The Supreme Court now sits at the center of history, and its decision will define whether America remains a nation of divided powers or whether executive control becomes the new normal. Supporters of Trump's move argue that chaos in cities has gotten out of control and that weak local leadership has allowed disorder to thrive. They point to spiraling crime rates, overwhelmed migrant services, open-air drug crises, and violent protests as proof that states are failing to maintain order. They say federal intervention isn't overreach, it's responsibility. They argue the founders intended for strong national defense, and today's threats come from within, as much as from outside enemies. To them, deploying the National Guard is decisive leadership, not tyranny. Opponents see it very differently. They warn that using military force inside American cities without state consent is authoritarianism, plain and simple. They argue that the Constitution is crystal clear. The military should not be used to police domestic populations, and certainly not for political gain. They warn that once a president gains the power to militarize local conflict, democracy becomes fragile. Critics say real leadership isn't sending in troops. It's strengthening communities, enforcing law fairly, and working with local governments instead of steamrolling them. This isn't about whether you like Donald Trump. This isn't about whether you live in Chicago or Portland. This is about the future of American self-government. Will the Supreme Court protect constitutional limits? Or will it hand the executive branch sweeping new military powers over U.S. soil? That ruling will echo for generations. And if you think this is just another news story, think again. This is a constitutional stress test, and every American, left, right, and independent, should be paying attention. We'll be tracking this every step of the way. Make sure you subscribe, drop your thoughts in the comments, and share this with someone who still believes the Constitution matters. This debate isn't over, it's just getting started.